January 27th, 1945. Stalag IX-A, prisoner of war camp, Ziegenhain, Germany. The snow fell in silent curtains across the compound, muffling the world in white. Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds stood inside the cramped barracks, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. 25 years old, born and raised in South Knoxville, Tennessee, he'd been a prisoner of the Third Reich for 38 days. Through the frost-covered window, he could see the guard towers silhouetted against the gray German sky, their machine guns trained on the skeletal buildings below. The metal loudspeaker crackled to life, its tinny voice cutting through the evening stillness. German words echoed across the compound, cold and precise. Edmonds didn't need a translator. He'd learned enough in his time here to understand the meaning, but one of the men who spoke German confirmed it anyway. All Jewish prisoners are to report for roll call tomorrow morning. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Around him, 1,292 American prisoners of war stirred uneasily. Some exchanged glances. Others stared at the floor. Everyone knew what separation meant. Throughout the war, Jewish soldiers captured on the Eastern Front had been murdered outright. Those taken on the Western Front were sent to Berga, a slave labor camp where men died in the darkness, breaking stones for the Reich. 200 of the men in this camp were Jewish, 200 men whose dog tags had once been stamped with an H for Hebrew. Most had destroyed them during the Battle of the Bulge, when capture seemed inevitable. Some had buried their prayer books in the Belgian snow. The U.S. Army had told them to erase any evidence of their faith if they were taken prisoner. Now the Germans were demanding they identify themselves. Edmonds felt the weight of every eye in the barracks turning toward him. As the highest-ranking non-commissioned officer in Stalag IX-A, these men were his responsibility. The decision was his to make. Outside, the wind howled through the barbed wire. Inside, no one spoke. He thought of the journey here, the 4-day forced march, from the battlefield to the railway station, watching men collapse and die in the snow. The boxcars at Gerolstein, 70 men packed into each one, no food, no water, eating snow to survive. The month at Stalag IX-B at Bad Orb, where Jewish prisoners had been separated into special barracks, given starvation rations while lice crawled across the filthy mattresses. Then the transfer here, to Stalag IX-A, the arrival ceremony they'd never forget. Nearly 1,300 men forced to stand in knee-high snow while German soldiers shouted at them, while dogs growled and snapped at their heels. And then, as the winter sun set, the guards had brought out a young Russian prisoner. They'd watched, forbidden to look away on pain of a rifle butt to the skull, as the dogs tore the man apart. This will happen to any one of you who does not do exactly what we say. That's what the Germans had told them. That's what awaited anyone who disobeyed. Edmonds looked at the faces around him. Boys, really. Most of them were kids from Tennessee, from the 106th Infantry Division, the Golden Lions. They'd shipped out to Europe in December of 1944, full of hope that they'd be home by Christmas. They'd arrived at the Belgian-German border just 6 days before Hitler launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge. They'd been thrown into hell with barely any training, surrounded and outgunned in the frozen Ardennes forest. On December 19, 1944, their commanding officer had surrendered. Edmonds became one of 20,000 Americans captured that day. Now he was responsible for keeping these men alive. A Methodist from South Knoxville, Edmonds had grown up attending church with his 3 brothers. His faith taught him that every life was sacred, that all men were created in God's image. The Geneva Convention said prisoners only had to give their name, rank, and serial number. Nothing about religion, nothing that would allow the Nazis to select men for death. Tomorrow morning, the Germans expected only the Jewish soldiers to appear for roll call. Tomorrow morning, Major Sigmund, the camp commandant, would separate them from the others. Tomorrow morning, 200 men would be sent to their deaths. Unless Roddie Edmonds did something about it. He straightened up, his jaw set with determination. The barracks fell silent as he began to speak, his Tennessee accent carrying clearly in the cold air. His orders were simple. His orders were clear. His orders would save lives or cost him his own. "Tomorrow morning," Edmonds said, his voice steady and calm, "every man in this camp will fall out for roll call. Every single one of us. January 28th, 1945. 0600 hours. Dawn broke gray and bitter over Stalag IX-A. The temperature hovered near zero, the kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals and made metal burn like fire to the touch. In the darkness before sunrise, 1,292 American prisoners of war emerged from their barracks and formed up in military ranks. Master Sergeant Edmonds stood at the front, his shoulders squared, his feet planted in the trampled snow. Behind him, row upon row of soldiers stood at attention, Christians and Jews, Protestants and Catholics, farm boys from Tennessee and city kids from New York, all of them together, all of them standing as one. Lester Tannenbaum stood directly beside Edmonds. The young Jewish soldier from New York had spent the night wondering if he'd see tomorrow. When the loudspeaker had announced that Jewish prisoners were to report, his stomach had turned to ice. He knew what separation meant. Everyone did. But when Edmonds had given his order, when he'd told everyone to fall out together, Tannenbaum had felt something he hadn't experienced since before the Battle of the Bulge. Hope. Now, standing in the pre-dawn darkness, he watched Edmonds's profile. The sergeant's face was calm, almost serene. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation in his stance. This was a man who'd made his decision and would face whatever came next. Paul Stern, a combat medic who'd been captured during the same battle, stood nearby. He'd survived the march from Belgium, the boxcars, the month at Bad Orb, where Jewish prisoners had been segregated and starved. He'd watched good men die from exposure, disease, and despair. And now he watched as every American prisoner in the camp stood together, refusing to let the Germans divide them. The barracks doors of the German command building swung open. Major Siegmann emerged, his greatcoat buttoned tight against the cold, his breath steaming in the frigid air. He was a Wehrmacht officer, not SS, but that distinction meant little anymore. This late in the war, everyone followed orders. Everyone knew what was happening to the Jews, and everyone knew that disobedience could mean death. Siegmund's boots crunched through the snow as he approached the formation. His eyes swept across the assembled prisoners, taking in the sight of every man in the camp standing at attention. His face darkened. This wasn't what he'd ordered. This wasn't what he'd expected. He'd demanded the Jews present themselves. Only the Jews. Instead, he was looking at the entire American contingent, formed up in perfect military order, with Master Sergeant Edmonds standing front and center. The commandant's pace quickened, his face flushed red despite the cold. He covered the distance to Edmonds in long, angry strides, his hand already reaching for the holster at his hip. "These men cannot all be Jews," Siegmund shouted in English, his accent thick, but his meaning crystal clear. Spittle flew from his lips, freezing in the air between them. "I gave orders. I gave specific orders. Only the Jewish prisoners were to report." Edmonds didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his eyes level, his voice calm and clear when he spoke. "We are all Jews here." 4 words. 4 simple words that changed everything. Siegmund's face went from red to purple. His hand closed around the grip of his Luger pistol, drawing it from the leather holster in one smooth motion. The metal gleamed dully in the gray morning light as he raised it, pressing the barrel against Edmonds's forehead. The cold steel bit into Edmonds's skin. At this range, he could see every detail of the weapon. A .08 Luger, 9mm, standard issue for Wehrmacht officers. One squeeze of the trigger and his skull would explode. His brains would paint the snow red. His body would crumple at Siegmund's feet, and the message would be clear to every other prisoner. This is what happens to those who defy the Reich. Behind Edmonds, 1,200 men held their breath. Tannenbaum, standing close enough to reach out and touch his sergeant, felt his heart hammering in his chest. He could see Siegmund's finger on the trigger. He could see the rage twisting the German's features, and he could see Edmonds standing absolutely still, unflinching, unafraid. "One last chance, Sergeant," Siegmund screamed, his voice cracking with fury. The pistol pressed harder against Edmonds's skull, hard enough to leave a circular mark on his skin. "You will order the Jews to step forward, or I will shoot you right now. Right here. Do you understand me?" The wind whistled through the barbed wire. Somewhere in the distance, a guard dog barked. The sun was rising behind the clouds, turning the eastern sky from black to gray. Time seemed to stretch and slow, each second lasting an eternity. Edmonds looked straight into Siegmund's eyes. He saw the anger there, the fear, the desperate need to maintain control. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. The Allies were pushing into Germany from both east and west. The Third Reich was collapsing. But that made men like Siegmund more dangerous, not less. A cornered animal fights hardest when it has nothing left to lose. When Edmonds spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, but every man in the formation heard him. "You can shoot me, Major, but you'll have to shoot all of us, because we know who you are." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Under the Geneva Convention, we're only required to give our name, rank, and serial number. That's all. Not our religion, not anything else." Edmonds took a breath, his Tennessee drawl carrying clearly in the frozen air. "And when we win this war, and we will win this war, you will stand trial for war crimes, and you will pay for what you've done." The silence that followed stretched like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Major Siegmund stood with his Luger pressed against Roddie Edmonds's forehead, his finger on the trigger, his entire body trembling with rage and something else. Something that looked, in the pale morning light, very much like fear. Behind them, 1,292 American prisoners of war waited to see if their sergeant would die for them. Tannenbaum watched Siegmund's face transform. The purple flush drained away, replaced by a pallor that had nothing to do with the cold. The German officer's eyes widened slightly, darting from Edmonds to the formation of soldiers behind him, then back to Edmonds. His hand, still gripping the pistol, began to shake. "We know who you are." Those words had struck home like a bullet. Siegmund wasn't SS. He wasn't a fanatical Nazi true believer. He was Wehrmacht, a career military officer who'd served his country and followed orders. But following orders didn't absolve a man of war crimes. The Nuremberg principles were already being discussed. Everyone knew what happened to officers who murdered prisoners. Everyone knew what came next. The Russians were advancing from the east, leaving a trail of vengeance in their wake. The Americans and British were pushing from the west. Germany was being crushed between two unstoppable forces. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was burning after barely 12, and when it fell, not if, but when the victors would demand justice. Edmonds stood perfectly still, the pistol barrel leaving an indentation in his skin. He didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't show an ounce of fear. This Methodist boy from Tennessee, this master sergeant who'd been in captivity for barely over a month, stared down a German officer with the absolute certainty of a man who knew he was right. Siegmund's Luger began to lower, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, then faster. His hand dropped to his side. His face had gone from purple to white to a sickly gray. He was shaking not from the cold, but from the realization of what he'd almost done, what he'd been about to do, what the consequences would have been. The commandant's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He looked at Edmonds. He looked at the assembled prisoners. He looked at the gun in his own hand as if he'd never seen it before. Then, without another word, Major Siegmund turned on his heel and stormed across the snow toward the command building. His boots kicked up white powder with each angry stride. He didn't look back. He didn't give another order. He simply walked away, the Luger hanging uselessly at his side. The door to the command building slammed shut behind him with a sound like a gunshot. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The American prisoners stood in their ranks, watching their sergeant, waiting for permission to believe what had just happened. Edmonds lowered his head slightly, feeling the spot on his forehead where the gun barrel had pressed. When he raised his eyes again, his gaze swept across the formation. He saw Tannenbaum beside him, tears streaming down the Jewish soldier's face. He saw Paul Stern, the medic, standing rigid with shock. He saw Christians and Jews, farm boys and city kids, all of them alive because one man had refused to back down. "Dismissed," Edmonds said quietly. "Get back inside. Stay warm." The formation broke apart slowly, men turning toward their barracks in groups of 2 and 3, their voices rising in a confused mixture of relief and disbelief. Some of them were crying. Others were laughing, the sound harsh and half hysterical. A few reached out to touch Edmonds as they passed, as if to confirm he was real, that this had actually happened, that they were all still alive. Tannenbaum grabbed Edmonds' hand, shaking it hard, unable to find words adequate for what he'd just witnessed. Stern did the same, his combat medic's instincts checking to make sure their sergeant was unharmed. Other Jewish soldiers crowded around, their eyes red, their voices choked with emotion. "Thank you," someone said. Then another voice, "You saved us." And another, "We thought we were dead." Edmonds accepted their gratitude with the same quiet dignity he'd shown facing down Siegmann. He nodded, squeezed shoulders, told them to get inside before they froze. He was their sergeant. This was his job. He'd done what any decent man would do, what any good officer should do. That's what his face said. That's what his demeanor suggested. But Tannenbaum, standing close enough to see the slight tremor in Edmonds' hands before he clasped them behind his back, knew the truth. Their sergeant had just stared death in the face and hadn't blinked. He'd gambled his life on the chance that a German officer would choose self-preservation over following orders. He'd bet everything on human nature at its most desperate. And he'd won. The days that followed January 28th were a strange mixture of routine and tension. Master Sergeant Edmonds continued his duties as senior NCO, organizing work details, settling disputes, doing everything he could to maintain morale and military discipline. The Jewish prisoners remained integrated with the rest of the American POWs. Major Siegmann never again demanded their separation. But the war ground on. February 1945 brought news from the east. The Soviets had crossed the Oder River and were pushing toward Berlin. In March, American forces crossed the Rhine. The Third Reich was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted, squeezed between two massive armies converging from opposite directions. Inside Stalag IX-A, the prisoners could feel the change. The guards became nervous, jumpy. Supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The German people themselves were starving, and POWs were the lowest priority. Men survived on watery soup and crusts of bread. Disease spread through the barracks. Some didn't make it. But Edmonds kept his men together, kept them organized, kept them alive. On March 29, 1945, word came that the Germans were evacuating the camp. All prisoners were to be moved west, away from the advancing Soviets. It was a death march order, and everyone knew it. Thousands of concentration camp prisoners were dying on the roads, shot by guards or simply collapsing from exhaustion. Edmonds refused to move his men. He informed the German officers that under the Geneva Convention, sick and wounded prisoners could not be forced to march. He declared every American in the camp medically unfit for travel. And when the guards threatened him, when they raised their rifles and shouted orders, Edmonds stood his ground once again. The Germans, with Allied armies closing in from all sides, didn't have time to argue. They abandoned Stalag IX-A on March 30th, the second day of Passover, the Jewish holiday, celebrating liberation from slavery in Egypt. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. On March 31st, 1945, American tanks rolled up to the gates of Stalag IX-A. The 104th Infantry Division liberated the camp, finding 1,292 American prisoners of war alive, standing in formation, led by Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds. 100 days. Edmonds had been a prisoner for 100 days. from December 19th to March 31st. Through the Battle of the Bulge, through the forced march, through the boxcars, through 2 POW camps, through starvation and cold, and the constant threat of death. And he'd brought his men home. The journey back to the United States was a blur of debriefings and medical checks, of being fed real food and sleeping in real beds. Edmonds reunited with his wife Marie, whom he'd married in 1942. He tried to return to normal life, to forget the things he'd seen, the things he'd endured. But some memories don't fade. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, Edmonds was called up again. He served his country once more, then finally came home for good. He divorced Marie, married again to Pauline Flora Surratt in 1948, but that marriage also ended. In 1953, he married Mary Ann Watson. Together, they raised 2 sons, Kim, Michael, and Christopher. Edmonds worked as a salesman, mobile homes, cable television, whatever paid the bills. He wrote for the Knoxville Journal for a while. He lived a quiet life in Tennessee, going to church on Sundays, raising his boys, being a good neighbor. He never talked about the war, not with his wives, not with his sons, not with anyone. On March 31st, 1945, American tanks rolled up to the gates of Stalag IX-A. The 104th Infantry Division liberated the camp, finding 1,292 American prisoners of war alive, standing in formation, led by Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds. 100 days. Edmonds had been a prisoner for 100 days, from December 19th to March 31st. Through the Battle of the Bulge, through the forced march, through the boxcars, through 2 POW camps, through starvation and cold, and the constant threat of death. And he'd brought his men home. The journey back to the United States was a blur of debriefings and medical checks, of being fed real food and sleeping in real beds. Edmonds reunited with his wife Marie, whom he'd married in 1942. He tried to return to normal life, to forget the things he'd seen, the things he'd endured. But some memories don't fade. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, Edmonds was called up again. He served his country once more, then finally came home for good. He divorced Marie, married again to Pauline Flora Surratt in 1948, but that marriage also ended. In 1953, he married Mary Ann Watson. Together, they raised 2 sons, Kim, Michael, and Christopher. Edmonds worked as a salesman, mobile homes, cable television, whatever paid the bills. He wrote for the Knoxville Journal for a while. He lived a quiet life in Tennessee, going to church on Sundays, raising his boys, being a good neighbor. He never talked about the war, not with his wives, not with his sons, not with anyone. When people asked, he'd shake his head and say, "Things happened that are too bad to share. We were humiliated." That was all. That was all he'd ever say. On August 8, 1985, Roderick W. Roddie Edmonds died at the age of 65. He was buried at Berry Highland Memorial Cemetery in Knoxville, Tennessee. His funeral was attended by family and friends who knew him as a quiet, humble man, a good father, a good husband, a good Christian. None of them knew he was a hero. Years passed. Roddie Edmonds's grave grew moss. His sons grew up, started families of their own. The story of what happened in Stalag IX-A on January 28, 1945, remained buried with the man who'd lived it. Then, decades later, a college assignment changed everything. Reverend Chris Edmonds's daughter came home one day with homework. She needed to create a video presentation about a family member for her history class. When she mentioned it to her grandmother, Roddie's widow, Mary Ann, the old woman, went to a closet and pulled out something she'd kept hidden for years. A diary. Roddie Edmonds had kept a diary during his time as a POW. He'd written down dates, events, the daily struggle to survive. He'd documented everything that happened at Stalag IX-B and Stalag IX-A, everything except the confrontation with Major Siegman. That part, the most important part, he'd kept to himself. Chris Edmonds read his father's diary with growing amazement. He'd known his dad was a veteran, But Roddie had never talked about the war in any detail. Now, reading these entries, Chris saw a different side of his father, a younger man, barely 25, thrust into a position of terrible responsibility. A leader who'd done his best to keep his men alive. But something was missing. Chris could sense it in the gaps between entries, in the things his father hadn't written down. There was more to this story. Frustrated but determined, Chris turned to the internet. He typed his father's name and rank into a search engine, not expecting much. What came up changed everything. A New York Times article from 2008 featured an interview with a Jewish veteran named Lester Tannenbaum, who now went by Lester Tanner. In the interview, Tanner mentioned that he owed his life to the bravery of Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds. Chris's hands shook as he read the article. Tanner described standing in the snow at Stalag IX-A. He described the German commandant demanding that Jewish soldiers identify themselves. He described Edmonds ordering every prisoner in the camp to fall out. He described the pistol pressed to his sergeant's forehead. "We are all Jews here." Chris couldn't believe what he was reading. His father, his quiet, humble father who'd worked in mobile home sales and never bragged about anything except his sons, had stood up to the Nazis with a gun to his head and saved 200 lives. And he'd never said a word. Chris tracked down Lester Tanner. The two men spoke on the phone, and Tanner confirmed every detail. He'd been standing right beside Edmonds that morning. He'd seen the whole thing. He'd thought he was going to die, and then this Baptist sergeant from Tennessee had put himself between death and his men. "Your father was a man of great courage," Tanner told Chris. "What he did that day, I wouldn't be here without him. None of us would." Chris found other survivors. Paul Stern, the combat medic, was still alive. So was Sonny Fox, another Jewish prisoner, who later became a famous children's television host. Each of them told the same story. Each of them remembered Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds standing his ground, refusing to let the Germans separate his men, willing to die rather than betray the soldiers under his command. Chris began advocating for his father's recognition. In 2015, 70 years after that frozen morning in Stalag IX-A, Yad Vashem, Israel's official Holocaust Remembrance Center, posthumously honored Roddie Edmonds as righteous among the nations. It's the highest honor Israel can bestow on a non-Jew for risking their life to save Jews during the Holocaust. Roddie Edmonds became the first American soldier and one of only 5 Americans ever to receive this recognition. He's also the only righteous among the nations to have saved American Jews. In 2016, President Barack Obama spoke about Edmonds during a Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremony. Roddie Edmonds went above and beyond the call of duty, Obama said, recognizing the sergeant's heroism before a national audience. Efforts began to award Edmonds the Medal of Honor. Congress introduced legislation first, the Roddie Edmonds Congressional Gold Medal Act, later amended to authorize the president to award the Medal of Honor posthumously. The U.S. Army initially resisted, saying Edmonds' actions weren't in combat and therefore didn't qualify. But his advocates kept pushing. On November 15, 2020, a historical marker was placed in Knoxville, Tennessee, donated by the Jewish American Society for Historic Preservation. It stands as a permanent reminder of what one man did on a frozen morning in Germany. Chris Edmonds wrote a book about his father, No Surrender, the story of an ordinary soldier's extraordinary courage in the face of evil. He travels the country giving speeches, sharing his father's story, keeping the memory alive. He was a leader who wouldn't ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do. Chris says, "This story is a clarion call to love one another, regardless of our choices or faith. He stood against oppression. He stood for decency. He stood for humanity." Section 6. The legacy lives on. Today, Lester Tanner is gone. Paul Stern has passed away. Sonny Fox died in 2018. The men who stood in the snow that morning, the men who watched their sergeant defy death for them, are fading away. Soon, there will be no one left who witnessed it firsthand. But the story endures. In synagogues and churches across America, people tell the story of Roddie Edmonds. In classrooms, students learn about the master sergeant who declared, "We are all Jews here," and meant it. In military academies, officers study his leadership, his moral courage, his refusal to abandon his principles, even when a gun was pressed to his head. The lesson is simple and profound. One person can make a difference. One person standing up for what's right can change the course of history. One person willing to sacrifice themselves for others can save hundreds of lives. Roddie Edmonds wasn't a general. He wasn't a Medal of Honor recipient, at least not yet. He wasn't famous or powerful or wealthy. He was a sergeant from South Knoxville, Tennessee. A Methodist who believed all men were created in God's image. A leader who took his responsibility seriously. And when the moment came when everything was on the line, when a single wrong move would mean death, he made the right choice. Major Sigmund's fate after the war remains unknown. Some records suggest he survived and returned to Germany. Others are unclear. What matters is that on January 28, 1945, he made a choice too. Faced with a sergeant who wouldn't back down, faced with the certainty that the war was ending and justice was coming, he chose to lower his gun and walk away. Humanity, even in the darkest times, can still break through. The 200 Jewish soldiers who were saved that day went on to live full lives. They married, had children, built careers. Their descendants number in the thousands now, people who exist because one man stood up when it mattered most. In Berry Highland Memorial Cemetery in Knoxville, Roddie Edmonds' grave marker is simple. It gives his name, his dates, his service in World War II and Korea. It doesn't mention Stalag IX-A. It doesn't mention the confrontation with Major Sigmund. It doesn't need to. The real memorial isn't made of stone. It's made of people. It's made of the thousands of descendants of the men he saved. It's made of every person who hears his story and resolves to stand up for what's right, to refuse to be complicit in evil, to risk everything for others. That's Roddie Edmonds' true legacy, not the medals or the honors or the historical markers, though those are important. His legacy is the reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting in spite of fear. It's doing what's right because it's right, not because it's safe. We are all Jews here. 4 words spoken on a frozen morning in Germany. 4 words that saved 200 lives. 4 words that echo through the decades, challenging each new generation to ask themselves, when the moment comes, when everything is on the line, what will I do? Master Sergeant Roddie Edmonds answered that question. He stood his ground. He protected his men. He looked death in the eye and didn't blink. And in doing so, he showed us all what it means to be truly human. The Germans couldn't believe what this American sergeant said next, but those words, and the courage behind them, changed history forever.